On the common link theory by Fahd Alhomoudi. These three muhaddiths, among others, acknowledge the rejection of this type of fard mutlaq by early muhaddiths, yet they still discuss it, trying to upgrade its level to an accepted one. One of the methods they used to re-evaluate the level of fard mutlaq was to reinterpret the opinions of the early muhaddiths. An obvious example of this was the reinterpretation of Nawawi. Nawawi comments on the term munkar which was used by Muslim. And Nawawi says, what Muslim meant by munkar is the rejected munkar, because the latter muhaddiths might call a fard narrated by a reliable person munkar, and yet they do not reject it as long as this reliable transmitter has a strong and solid memory. Contemporary muhaddiths elaborated further on this. Ibrahim al-Lahim, for instance, discusses how the later muhaddiths reinterpreted the position of early muhaddiths in both theory and practice. In justifying their opinion, later muhaddiths suggested that the differentiation between them and the early muhaddiths was just a matter of definition, which had to do with language and not the categories of fard. Thus, later muhaddiths had to reinterpret what early muhaddiths had stated. For example, later muhaddiths state that when the early muhaddiths rejected a hadith classifying it as munkar, they referred to the text, not to the isnad. Al-Lahim, however, abandoned this interpretation, supporting his argument with three pieces of evidence. First of all, there is no clear differentiation between the early and later muhaddiths as to the precise linguistic meaning of the term munkar, in terms of its relation to matan and isnad, so defining correct usage of the word munkar interchangeably requires further investigation. The latter muhaddiths' assumption would be considered invalid unless they provide sufficient evidence, which substantiates their claim about the different semantic application of the word munkar. Secondly, the early muhaddiths used terms other than munkar to describe the weakness of tafarrud, such as khata, error, and batil, invalidity, which later muhaddiths cannot claim any linguistic ambiguity reasonably applies to. Thirdly, accepting the latter muhaddith's interpretation of munkar means accepting the ziyadat al-thiqa, extra phases added by hadith by a reliable transmitter. But later muhaddiths do not accept ziyadat al-thiqa, and consequently their interpretation contradicts their assumption. The second category of this type of fard is fard nisbi, namely hadith that is relatively fard. Muhaddiths have divided the fard nisbi into three kinds, based on the characteristics of its isnad. The first kind is the fard found among transmitters within one particular city or region. Examples of this type are very common, such as the hadith of Abdullah ibn Amr, in which he narrates that the Prophet told his companion that a piece of land belonging to a non-Arab would be yours, and that you would find it in public baths, meaning hammams. If a man wanted to enter these public baths, he would be obliged to enter with proper attire, and women would not be allowed to enter these public baths except for health treatment. This tradition was only narrated in Syria, where cold weather invites the public use of the use of public baths. It was not narrated in warm cities like Mecca and Medina, simply because the institution of the public bath did not exist there. Another example is the hadith narrated by Aisha, in which the Prophet left her in a happy mood and returned sad. Upon asking him what had caused his sadness, he replied, "I entered the Kaaba, and I am afraid that I have caused difficulty for people." The Prophet realized that everyone would now want to enter the Kaaba because the Prophet had done so, posing a difficulty because the Kaaba is not big enough for all the Muslims to enter. As this hadith related to entering the Kaaba, which is located in Mecca, it was only narrated by transmitters from Mecca. From these two examples, we may conclude that if a subject of a hadith is irrelevant to the people living in the location where it is narrated, then the authenticity of the hadith is questionable, as is clearly illustrated in the next example. According to Hakim and al-Bayhaqi, Abdullah bin Zayd narrated that while the Prophet was preparing his ablution, he did not clean his ears with the same water he used to wipe his hair. Only Egyptian transmitters narrated this tradition, because the wudu of the Prophet is relevant to all regions, since region is not an issue and the hadith has no specific relevance to Cairo or Egypt. Al-Hakim concluded that the tradition is gharib, anomalous, and should be considered weak, da'if. These examples lead to the same conclusion arrived at by Andreas Gork, who avers, when we use a single source with a regional focus on Iraq, we might wrongly consider an Iraqi partial common link to be the common link of the whole tradition, just because the author failed to record many of the Syrian or Egyptian traditions. Even if we managed to record a Syrian and an Egyptian isnad, these single strands might be considered to be later dives. A second kind of fard nisbi is characterized as one transmitted by a successor to only one of his pupils. This, however, does not imply that the hadith cannot be found elsewhere. we might find another successor who transmitted the same hadith from the same companion, or we might find the same hadith narrated from the Prophet by another companion, a shahid, and then spread throughout several strands. For example, when the companion Ibn Mas'ud asked the Prophet which sin is the worst, the latter replied, "The worst sin is considering anything or anyone equal to God who created you." Ibn Mas'ud asked him again, "What is the second worst sin?" The Prophet answered, "To kill your child so that he does not eat your food." Ibn Mas'ud then asked, "What is the third worst sin?" And the Prophet answered, "To commit adultery with your neighbour's wife." According to Al-Hakim, this hadith was narrated by Ibn Mahdi from Al-Thawri, who transmitted it from Wasil. Ibn Mahdi was the only transmitter who narrated this hadith from Al-Thawri, but Al-Hakim did not mean to say that the hadith does not exist elsewhere. He means that Ibn Mahdi was the only transmitter who narrated this hadith from Sufyan, from Shaqiq, from Amr ibn Shuhrabil, from Ibn Mas'ud, while others transmitters narrated it from Shaqiq, from Ibn Mas'ud, not via Amr. Furthermore, as Muslim points out in his editorial comment, this hadith was supported by a verse in the Quran, which states, Allah said, "Those who invoke not with Allah any other God, nor slay such a life as Allah has made sacred, except for a just cause, nor commit fornication, and anyone that does this not only meets punishment." The following diagram illustrates the aforementioned details regarding the transmission of this hadith. Stay tuned.